Margaret Beale Spencer is the Marshall Field IV Professor of Urban Education in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Before returning to Chicago, and when we hear her life story, you'll understand the part about returning to Chicago, she was director of the University of Pennsylvania's Center for Health Achievement, Neighborhood Growth, and Ethnic Studies. And if you got the acronym, it spells changes. She also guided as its director the W.E.B. Du Bois Collective Research Institute. Spencer's phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, acronym PBEST, serves as the foundation for her gendered and race ethnicity-focused research emphasis, which addresses resiliency, identity, and competence formation processes for diverse youth, both in the US and abroad. I could spend an hour on the introduction, so I'll just mention a few honors and awards. Margaret has received an honorary degree from the University of Pennsylvania. She received the APA Senior Career Award for Distinguished Scientific Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest. She was an inaugural fellow of AERA, the American Educational Research Association. And in 2009, she was elected as a member of the National Academy of Education. And most recently, the acronym that many of you will be familiar with, she received the SRCD Award for contributions to cultural and ecological research. She's also been one of my heroes for quite a few years, so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to chat with her and find out more about her background. So I'd like to start with a fairly general question. Can you tell us about what it was like growing up and how you decided to do what you're doing, etc.?
First, thank you very much for having me here in this context. I really appreciate it, because Doug is one of my heroes as well. My background is rather interesting relative to developmental science, because growing up, I never heard of psychology. My plan was to become a pediatrician. And I grew up the youngest of 3 daughters. Was born and raised in Philadelphia. My parents were born and raised in Philadelphia. My mother as well. My father grew up there. I grew up as shared, I think, with 2 sisters. I'm the youngest. No one believes that I have a personality type that suggests the youngest child, but I grew up the youngest of 3 daughters in Philadelphia. My mother pretty much raised us. Our parents were divorced early. People really don't understand the experiences of war in lives. Today we talk more about it. But certainly at that time, I think the Second World War was the first war that many African-American men served in. Therefore, it was a tough war for a lot of African-American men. And it certainly touched my family in terms of, I'm sure, my father suffered from PTSD because, you know, it was just very tough being in the Navy. And that's the nice thing that I learned from adversity. And that is, you can learn some lessons about the impact of context without being aware that that's what you're learning. My mother's 2 brothers and my father's 2 brothers were incredible resources, you know, and each had served a different part of the military. And they came home with different stories, and different lessons were learned. They were just amazing men. My mother raised 3 of us pretty much on her own, with very clear values concerning the importance of learning and schooling, you know, working hard, and being good people. You know, that mattered a great deal. In fact, in my community, I was known as one of those Beale girls. And Beale girls conducted themselves in a certain way, had a certain orientation relative to school, etc. My mother had clear expectations for us. As I shared, I was the youngest, and I think I was probably the more rambunctious of the three of us. I probably got in more trouble than the other two, obviously, who took care of me pretty much. And I taught myself to read by the time I started kindergarten at 4. And that was pretty much because I just loved, watching my sisters do things. And I probably was a little envious, because I remember when they went to school, I literally remember seeing myself at the window staring out, literally crying because I couldn't go with them to school. So I taught myself to read by the time I was, before I was 4, and I learned to read from cereal boxes and the Sunday comics. No one really believed that I knew how to read until I began reading the words in the balloons, and it made sense. The balloons meaning the comic book text. And my mother began working pretty much around before I turned 4. And because she had been very active in the school, local school, with my sisters, they allowed me to go to school when I was 4. So I spent 2 years in kindergarten being the leader person in the school, in a kindergarten class. So I could read the labels in terms of milk, et cetera, and I would give out chocolate or white milk to students and crackers, and I was in charge, and it felt real good. So I had those very positive experiences growing up, and I attended the local school through kindergarten in the first 3 years, and then I became probably a little bored, and I've always been a little vocal. And I've always been able to share my analysis of the world. And it probably wasn't a very popular thing in the elementary school. So luckily, because my mother's involvement in the school and the PTA, et cetera, the principal of the school had been one of my mother's high school teachers, in fact. So I was sent to sort of a experimental school in Philadelphia. It was part of the school district, but it was really a very customized school. It was pretty much majority Jewish, majority white, with some diversity there. And it was a very exciting experience for me because as I shared, the curriculum was very experimental-like. We changed classes in elementary school. And I had these really interesting teachers who, were excited that people had ideas and perspectives, and they sort of reinforced that. I had experiences that showed me that that one could do things to help oneself if he had any sort of challenge. For me, I was a pretty ingrained stutterer. Yes, I was a very serious stutterer. And when I changed schools and went to this little demonstration school, it was called Thaddeus Stevens School of Practice. And it became, after we graduated, the Masterman School, which is still one of the highest performing schools in Philadelphia. It was a wonderful school, and we had classes, we changed classes, we had a variety of classes, for example, choral speaking. And by that time, I had seen speech clinicians, speech teachers, etc. But I learned through choral speaking that I could control the stuttering with a cadence, through learning to speak to, if you will, poetry and rhyme. And it helped me a great deal, gave me even more confidence. But most importantly, I had incredible teachers in the first 3 years in terms of my Miss Taylor, who was my kindergarten teacher, Miss Gregg, who was my second grade teacher. But at Thaddeus Stevens, I had teachers that were really very interesting in this culturally diverse school. What I learned there was that no one had a corner on intellectual prowess. No one. That given the ethnic diversity, everyone, could have challenges. And I think that gave, at least me, a lot of confidence in a certain perspective, which I found throughout my life to be very helpful. That no one has a corner on intellectual prowess. And I think that's the stigma and the message through how gap findings are portrayed in the literature that unfortunately many kids pick up and believe. I never had that experience. I learned religious, if you will, tolerance by doing projects on the religions of the world, and in that school there were kids who represented religions of the world. And you learn, at least I learned, both that some religious and their cultural expression, had implications for girls in particular ways. One of my best friends was a girl who was a Muslim, and we visited various churches, on the Parkway in Philadelphia and other places, learned that, she could not enter certain houses of religion, and what that meant for her, and reinforcing a sense of difference. Another really good friend was a Chinese girl. She came from Chinatown, Helen Marx. And Helen already knew, we were just in elementary school, 4th, 5th, or 6th grade, that she had constraints on what she could become because she was a girl. So there were just lots of wonderful experiences had in this school. I mean, it was quite diverse, but predominantly Jewish. And so we didn't celebrate Christmas, we celebrated Hanukkah. And so, I mean, I learned all kinds of, Jewish holiday songs and stories that my mother had to have interpreted in terms of their accuracy from extended relatives who were Black Jews in my family. So it was just a wonderful experience, and I learned, I think, lifelong lessons. For example, as I shared, that, prowess, basically sees no singular face. It's divided across individuals. And I learned that from Miss Allen, my 5th grade teacher. And Mr. Kushner, my 6th grade teacher, I really learned the importance of taking responsibility for what you do, what you produce. And that's extremely important to me today. What he would do in terms of how he ran his class was that he would tell us in the beginning, you generate your own grades, and you have to own them. So he made us assign our report card grades ourselves. His instructions were, if you overestimate how well you did or what you had earned, you would get 1 grade less than the earned grade. And if you were not candid and confident about what you had earned and assigned yourself a grade lower, then you would get the grade that you assigned yourself. So he made you look at yourself, with great candor and take responsibility. These were incredibly important lessons that I learned that I think continue to have an impact on me today. In other words, you have to know who you are. So those were some of the schooling experiences and family experiences. And one more thing in terms of my wonderful uncles. My uncles on my father's side in particular, they got married late, so they lived at home for a long time. So we would visit our grandparents. And at dinner, they called it supper, you couldn't just sit there and have, childlike conversations. You had to take, in essence, analyze events that were going on, take a position, and defend that position. And they treated us like we were adults. And I really liked that. And I liked the idea of, being asked to think about, worldly events and take a position and defend that position. And they made us do that always as children. And I felt that they were, looking back, they were incredibly important lifelong decisions. So no, I did not know about psychology. I thought I was heading into a career of, pediatric medicine. But those foundational perspectives and values, I think were really important, remain important to me today.
So was there the expectation you would go to college?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. There was, we didn't have a lot of resources. And so the expectation was that the three of us would go to college, but I'm the youngest. And so by the time it came to me, I pretty much had to make sure that it happened for myself. So for me, it was strategizing for scholarships to go to college. So that's how I sort of problem solved. I must go to college. There's no other trajectory but I also had to figure out how to get there, which again was a very helpful experience.
Okay, and was there, and in college, where did you go to college, undergraduate school?
As I shared, I had a scholarship to college, and it was a 4-year scholarship, so even that was a consideration. And I wanted to go to medical school. So the question was, always loving science and math, how would you get through medical school? Okay, you've got a scholarship to college, but next steps, medical school. And so I decided not to take straight chemistry, but I decided to take pharmacy, because I didn't know anybody who was working with an undergraduate degree in chemistry, but I knew people who were working with undergraduate degrees in pharmacy. So it made sense to make sure that I could get through medical school by having always extra sources of money, and pharmacy seemed to be the way, except what I did not know was that at that point, the majority of pharmacy students were males. Now, you have to picture this. I'd gone to an all-female high school. It's a very good competitive high school, and did very well, and was very confident, etc. And I didn't think about the context, the gender-linked context in college. And so I attended undergraduate school, did the first year on the college campus, and then the next 4 years on the medical campus in the College of Pharmacy. But like medical school back then, pharmacy school was pretty much all males. I was in a class of almost 100 students with 5 females. It was very interesting, given that the fellows were also in the same fraternities with the professors. So for 5 years, I only had male teachers. The one woman who taught in the College of Pharmacy and who had a PhD, she gave out glassware. So becoming aware of the impact of gender on one's educational experience became quite evident. So the question I posed to my mother is that I didn't want to go to medical school for 5 years under these conditions. It was pretty uncomfortable. So my mother looked at me and said, I'm called Margie in my family of origin. I said, Margie, what do you do with a half a pharmacy degree? And I said, okay, Mom, I guess I finished a degree. and I needed to think through then what would come next. So to get to psychology, I stumbled into psychology. After I finished undergraduate school, I had met the man of my life, who was a graduate student in organic pharmaceutical chemistry at rival pharmacy college. And we met in my 4th of the 5 years, and we got married right after my graduation, and moved for him to pursue his PhD in organic pharmaceutical chemistry, and for me to work as a hospital pharmacist to become licensed. Because if you spend 5 years in a program, getting a license is probably a good thing. So that's what I did. But after the first year, and I'd satisfied the criteria for licensing, and I was driving an hour back and forth to this hospital pharmacy, I decided, well, my husband suggested that I just work part-time and take a couple of classes. But before leaving that, what I'd learned, even though I knew at that point I didn't like pharmacy because I just didn't like the context of learning. I was working in hospital pharmacy at a time when hospitals were doing a lot of compounding. So I ended up working and observing children who were dying of either renal disease or they were in the pediatric oncology clinic. And so I observed these youngsters who were dying in the context of their families. I did not know what I was looking at, but what I observed was that something was happening in these families, that these children were dying, but they had such energy and hopefulness that literally was keeping the families together. You could see it. I mean, they were leaning on this kid for sustenance. As I shared, I was a basic science student. I didn't know what I was observing. But my husband's suggestion, that second year, I decided to work part-time and take some classes and decide, what I wanted to do next. So the fall semester, I took a course, it looked interesting, in psychology. In 5 years of undergraduate training, I'd had basically math and science. So I took a class in Psychology 101. And so I had my little dictionary, and I would go to the lecture, and I would listen and take notes. And then the second semester, I took a course that looked interesting and seemed consistent with my training, and that was a research methods course. That research methods course in psychology was taught by Grace Heider, and she was the wife of Fritz Heider, the social psychologist theorist who developed the balance theory. And Grace Heider taught this class in a little amphitheater. It was a large class because students waited until the last semester of their last year as psychology majors to take this class. And because it ended up being a large class, she asked that we get our final grades from her personally. So we had to go to her office and go through the grades and understand why we got this grade. And I went to see her, and she said, "Oh, you're Margaret Beale Spencer." She says, "Do you want to come to graduate school?" And I said, "Oh my goodness, you don't know who I am." I said, "This is my second course in psychology, and I'm new." And she said, "This is how I recruit, and I never make a mistake. Do you want to come into our doctoral program?" And I said, "Absolutely." And that's how I was introduced into a doctoral program in psychology, and it was the most incredible experience of my life. Early on, in that first fall, it was apparent to someone, I don't remember the source of recommendation, that I was more of a developmentally thinking person in their social psychology department. So they suggested that I go speak with Frances Deegan Horowitz, who headed up the Human Development Program at KU. And she was
KU is Kansas University?
The University of Kansas. The University of Kansas in Lawrence, Kansas. And I went to talk with her, and I'd been reading like crazy because I was excited about being in this new field. And I told her what I thought I might want to do as a project, because by that time I knew I would only have time for a master's degree. My husband was going through his PhD in organic pharmaceutical chemistry very quickly, so it was only going to take him 3 years, so I knew I had 1 year to do something. So I shared with her what I was thinking about in terms of a master's thesis project, and she supported, my construction of an experimental, in essence, a project in a reinforcement system. And that's what happened, and the rest is history. I finished a master's thesis there. My husband was taking his first job in Illinois, and she suggested that I apply to the University of Chicago for my PhD, which I did as the only application that I put in because I didn't know any better. Frances suggested it, and I believed that she understood my needs, and that's what I did. I ended up at the University of Chicago, and again, it was the most incredible experience in my life. So you have to understand, the time I was in my neighborhood school for those first 3 years of three primary school grades until my graduate experience at Chicago, I'd also never had a professor of color. I had teachers in the first part of my elementary school programming, but didn't seem to matter. What I experienced throughout this period were some extraordinary individuals. And I mean, there were some challenges as well, right? But I also experienced some fascinating, really helpful human beings who seemed to treat everyone as human beings. And they were experienced as sources of support, concern, and interest.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about some of the challenges?
Oh, certainly. As I shared, for graduate programming, some of the challenges, let's see, carrying around a psychology dictionary because I had to learn as I took my classes because there were so many terms and so many technical terms I didn't know, so that certainly was a challenge. In terms of graduate school, another challenge was diverse individuals' development or experiences were never a part of the coursework. But some people were interested in your asking questions, and they would do what they could to respond. But those were definitely challenges, never seeing this, in essence, the self reflected in your courses, in the content. It was like your whole family, your whole history were invisible unless you looked in the index under pathology, deviance, problems, and then you'd see something about the experiences of minorities. That was a challenge. And in some ways, it continues to be so. But there were also lots of supports and protective factors. The protective factors for me certainly were my own experiences growing up in my family of origin. That continued to be a source of protection. And so certainly my husband was always a source of support. Let's see, also supportive were individuals who were just interesting and were just supportive. When I was at KU, I really learned about context by taking courses from the original ecological psychologists. So, Herbert Wright, Barker and Gump, you were sat in classes and you listened to their thinking about how context impacts human experience. And so those were definitely very special experiences. At Chicago, in fact, who was at that time, the Marshall Field fourth professor was Edgar Epps. And he was a sociologist, and he taught urban education issues as a sociologist. He ended up being my chair as well, my committee. He was absolutely amazing. And lots of other professors, as I shared. Francis Deacon Horowitz was an incredible mentor, my first mentor in psychology before meeting Epps and other people. So there were also lots of supports, and it made a difference. Taking my first job, finishing my PhD, certainly challenges included not being very sophisticated. But I would say to you students in the audience, take the time to understand where you're interested in teaching and working professionally. It was a different historical period, and I never did that research because I didn't think about it. I simply had done my work in terms of the training. I loved and love what I do, so the motivation was there. So I didn't think about the context. So inadvertently ending up being the first this or the first that is nothing that I sought. It just happened. And being the first of anything is fraught, with difficulties and with challenges. So I ended up in my first job being the first person of color to be in a tenure line position at that university, going into a department of psychology with 20 white males, period. You heard me, 20 white males. And I just hadn't thought about it. I really hadn't done my homework. I simply was excited about doing my research. So you have to do your research, young people. You must do your research. I don't think that would happen today necessarily, but there is that history that one should be aware of. So I didn't do my research, and I paid the price for that.
Yeah, lots of times graduate students may go through a program and there are lots of requirements, so they fulfill the requirements, and then they take their first job and they have to face the issue of, what do I want to do for my research program? Or, what am I going to do with the rest of my life? How was it for you?
I was, number one, I guess because of my history, my training, I was always very confident about the underlying science and research methods. Being a scientist was never an issue for me. I was trained to be a scientist, and I happen to love science. But what I found and what I find most intriguing was the messiness of who we are as humans. And factoring, if you will, that messiness into the sort of stringent design of science is what I continue to find challenging, but grounded. And it gives me a sense that, that I stay connected with humanity. So what I would say is that in terms of my training and my dissertation, I ended up doing a project that was theoretically grounded and was empirically pretty sophisticated, such that I always kept a list of next steps in terms of projects. So as I completed my dissertation, when I finished it to go off to my first job, I had a list of, in essence, next step questions. And so that helped me to take my first job, and I started my first job in January, and I had my first NIMH funding by December of that year. Because when I took my first job, I already had a list of things that I wanted to do. So within 3 months, when the NIMH deadline, in essence, was up, I had my first proposal in, and they gave me what they called a Christmas present, letting me know in that December that I would be funded for this first project. But it came out of having that list of next steps. And so the next steps were innovative enough, different from my dissertation, but allowed the dissertation to serve as a foundation for carrying out those next steps.
And what was the topic of your first grant proposal?
My first grant proposal, what I found in my first, in my dissertation was sort of these interesting relationships that were different from what the literature stated about youngsters, young children's understanding of race and color from a cognitive perspective, given normal human developmental changes. And so what I wanted to do in that first project was to test the question of the role of egocentricity in that process by increasing the sample in terms of age. And so I wanted to look at when older early primary school kids are no longer protected by cognitive egocentrism, what would that mean for their self-processes and their views concerning, if you're objective, if you will, views or connotations concerning colors and concerning race. And I thought that was really important in terms of the Clark's work, which still pretty much dominated our views concerning children and their psychosocial functioning. It was important to say and to demonstrate that their views concerning color and race represented straightforward learning phenomena and had nothing to do with how they felt about the self, because that was influenced by their cognitive maturation. So demonstrating that empirically with a older primary school population, although replicated as well with a younger population, was important. Doing that project was very interesting because it overlapped with an event, which was the missing and murdered child crisis of Atlanta. So number one, that situation was psychologically just mesmerizing to me as a parent, but it also made me focus in terms of, well, what does this mean for the development of boys? Are boys developing in terms of these messages and stigma in the same way of girls as girls? So it allowed me to kick in, if you will, an examination of the role of gender in this whole process. So my work moving towards adolescence, so it evolved from the programmatic work, asking these questions, integrating the role of cognition with affectivity, looking at, in essence, competence, processes, and resiliency or positive outcomes given the face of stigma, given the face of incredible risk that these young kids were facing on a daily basis. And my own children made a difference for me in terms of trying to raise my own children of color, understanding the literature, but also understanding the risk and trying to beef up, if you will, the supports and opportunities. So personally, in my family, I was raising children, but also in my science, trying to keep these balanced and separate was a challenge as well. But I think each informed the other, because all three kids are now scientists too.
Very interesting. I don't know if it was the case at the time you were doing the research, but even to this day, a lot of research comparing ethnicities is kind of framed with deficits models in mind. What can we do to boost the achievement of these poor kids? You haven't followed that path and you've looked at resilience and things like that. Is it when you were 5 years old that you decided on this, your own resilience, or how did you have the courage to take this perspective?
I've never forgotten who I am and where I'm from, and I've never forgotten my mother's own resiliency. My mother, I think, did a very effective job raising us in terms of values and modeling those values, but I understand that she herself was really quite resilient in that our growing up was more challenged by the fact that we were missing a whole set of grandparents. My mother, when she was 13 years old, she lost her mother and her father within a month of each other. And not only did she lose her mother, but the aunt who would have raised her, her mother's own favorite sister, also died. And that occurred about within a 6-month period before they discovered isoniazid for TB. And so my mother's mother died, and her sister, my mother's mother, who would have been her aunt, died, who would have raised them instead. And then 1 month later, her father died on Mother's Day. And her father was the first black civilian deep sea diver off the wharf in Philadelphia. And he went down in was large metal suits, that you see in pictures. And they brought him up and he was dead. And just like that, 5 children were orphaned, and my mother was 13 years old. And over the years, hearing the stories about how they had to cope with such an incredible loss in a short amount of time, I didn't understand what I was hearing, but I understood, in essence, strengths, how you pull in strengths to deal with adversity that heinous. Similarly, as I shared, even though I realized that I wasn't going to become a pharmacist in terms of work, I learned something from that experience. I learned watching these children who were, dying from renal disease and cancer. I watched them cope. I watched them pull strengths from somewhere that kept not only themselves together, but their families. So I did not know what I was observing, but I've always been exposed to strengths. So having been a little black girl myself growing up in the Northeast, and always knowing that I was healthy and positive, in fact, super in my own arrogance, I knew that something was wrong when I read the literature with the conclusions that were being reported in books. So when I started in psychology in that year, doing that master's thesis, what I didn't share is that we also had our first child. And not only had I had these prior experiences observing something I didn't understand, I had my first child, and I knew that something was wrong with the literature because this wonderful, gorgeous little child could not be what they listed in the text. So something was wrong with the textbooks. And I've never veered from that conclusion, that certainly people's writings about kids of color was devoid of any real experiences with the population. So therefore, they themselves were influenced by the stigma, by the assumptions, without data, or their interpretations of the data were so flawed. They never acknowledged the role of one's own processing, i.e. one's own cognitive processing, if you will, having an impact on how what one inferred from the stigma that represent the American experience when it comes to black people. So I never bought it. I never bought it. As I shared, as a child going to school and having these, experiences, I always knew that challenge was never an experience of a particular group, that everyone experienced intellectual challenges in terms of some things being, in essence, more difficult than others. And it was never leveled with one group, but the text would have one believe that. So I never believed the text. And therefore, my professional life has had a different set of assumptions about diverse experiences. Similarly, I've never believed that everyone who does not look like you is your enemy. I've never had that view because of how I was raised and my own experiences in school. Similarly, I've never assumed that people who look like you necessarily are in support of you. So I've always had sets of experiences that have allowed me to look at things pretty much, objectively. And maybe that was the science portion of the training, I don't know. But I also learned that those experiences should be grounded in real life. So I have to acknowledge the role of context. That's what a theoretical perspective is called, a phenomenological variant of ecological systems theory, because it reminds us, in terms of phenomenology, is that there is always this, in essence, process of inferring about others' inferences about each other that really matter and that are linked to the nature of the context. And so people always ask, why phenomenological, Spencer? And I'll say, well, it's phenomenological as well because I want people to basically have difficulty with that word and therefore be reminded how important, this process is. So just my little bit of humor, which is challenged.
Okay. Well, I could imagine a number of researchers who might have your ideas about resiliency, and they might develop a resiliency scale and measure a single thing and do the correlation analyses. But you have always been characterized in your own work more of a systems level analysis with lots of measures. Is that wanting to take advantage of the pharmacology training or being exposed to the KU ecological orientation? Or?
Well, I think it's a combination. I think the basic science training always allowed me to understand the myriad influences on the outcome of an experiment. When you are ordering rats or mice for an experiment, you want to make sure of the history of those animals. Let's face it, because you want, in essence, not to have a different history in terms of how they were raised to impact, your experiment. And I've always known from multiple levels of all the possibilities. And I learned from, my KU experience with Fritz Heider in particular, about the importance of understanding, if you will, how things are linked to other things. So a systems orientation was just a given for me. I think theory is also very important, so I've always liked to splice theory together. PVEST stands on the shoulders of at least a dozen or two other theories. So PVEST is really a synthesis of at least a couple of dozen theories that speak to the human condition and human processes, and that we're always in this a process of systems. You do one thing, something else will happen, and we know that when we do basic science. I mean, while I was in pharmacy school, I worked in a gastroenterology lab in one of the labs in the medical school, and was similar, in terms of what you do and how things are linked. So nothing's in isolation. And so having a way of thinking about how things link together has been very much a part of who I am and how I think, and my understanding of who we are as humans linked to context, in particular psychohistorical moments. And that to do the best science in order to understand what supports make sense. Because all supports may not be perceived as supportive, because things are linked together, so you have to understand that. And that's another reason why I talk about human vulnerability, that all humans, are beset both with risk factors and challenges, but also protective factors and supports. And somehow the literature, would have us believe that, given our finite science orientation, you want to look at this piece, or that piece, but yet no one puts it all together. Oh, thank you.
Sure.
See, Dr. Meaden is also a gentleman and a scholar. So for me, it's really important in terms of my commitment to understand how to support diverse humans, to understand how things are linked together. So both in terms of theorizing, yes, as influenced by my early experiences in another field, and with researchers and theorists like Fritz Heider, certainly like Herb Wright, an ecological psychologist, and also the biological undergirding of all of this, given my own training. I think they're all linked, and it's up to us to show how those linkages fit together in order to design the best supports to get the best outcomes. I think early on, some of the competence theorizing was equally helpful. So I think I have been gifted by exposure to, really incredible theoretically oriented researchers, and been gifted by a lot of experiences both in basic science and also their applications in real time and real complex settings with humans. And I really appreciate that history. It has helped me a great deal. So I would have significant dissonance trying to cut off just one piece, because the world is not that way. And for me, I really pursue truth in order to understand how to maximize resiliency and competent outcomes for everyone. And everyone has different risk factors, different challenges. So how you have to support diverse people of necessity has to be varied. And my science is committed to appreciating that variation.
And based on the work, your wonderful research career, what kind of advice would you have for policymakers who are trying to address some of these issues?
Well, I really think that too often policymakers, look at outcomes and they don't try to piece those outcomes together in terms of contemporary conditions. And I think that's really a problem. I think policymakers really don't always think about context and don't always think about human nature. They assume that policy is going to be implemented the same way for everyone. And that certainly is not the case, especially if you recognize the environmental constraints. And it is a serious issue for me, because it means that policymakers may, through governmental largesse or whatever, commit resources to a strategy that may not have the outcomes that are desired, because they're not thinking about the context, the psychohistorical moment, and that includes, if you will, the stigma that's a part of American life. And when that happens, and the outcomes are not what were intended, it means then that the problematic outcomes are in essence assumed to be the problem of the recipients of the policy, as opposed to the short-sightedness of the policymakers. And I think that is very, very problematic. So my view is that policymakers, I think out of context. Think out of context themselves, and I think we also don't think about who we are. We drag our own identities, we drag our own histories into the policy arena. And I think very often people have not dealt with who they are, which means then they're much more concerned with, posturing and being viewed as the cure-all, as opposed to trying to understand the sort of nuanced character which represents these United States, given our history. And I think that's unfortunate, but I think that's what we're still troubled by.
We're going to get through about 1/3 of the questions that I had for you, so I want to skip ahead a little bit. I'd like to, when we were chatting before, I was asking you a little bit about the future, and you said, well, do you want to know my fears or my hopes? And I would like to know both with respect to our field. What are your fears in terms of what kinds of issues should we be thinking about that we're putting under the rug, and what kind of hopes do you have?
Well, the fears have to do with are not as a field our not coming to grips with our contributions to the situation that we're in right now relative to, I think, inadequate science. I think there are people who have such significant needs to be viewed as a scientist that they don't understand that, there are other themes about who we are as humans that get in the way of the production of science. And I think I'm very fearful about that. I mentioned to you that I am really admiring of some of Ericksonian theorizing that I'm going to drag back into the 21st century because I think he had insights that we need to think about today. In his epigenetic model, when he talks about stage 6, and of course he's talking about issues of sexuality, and he says that, it's important, to basically have sexual polarization in order not to experience bisexual confusion. So he's talking about, sexuality, but I think it's applicable to any demographic that makes us who we are. Because what he's really saying is that in order to embrace or understand the experiences of others, you need to pull back and figure out who we are. And as a discipline, as a science, I don't think we've done that. I think people have identity needs. I think as scientists, we have these needs to have power and control, but we don't take the responsibility of having knowledge that could make a difference if we first examine our own motivations, our own histories. I have a visual for this. I'm going to share this with you, and you cannot use my idea because I know who you are, each and every one of them. I have an idea for a dust cover for a book that I'm working on, and so I want to have a gilded mirror, an old gilded mirror, a floor-length mirror, and I have this plain old healthy duck, our psychological community, right? Our plain old duck, healthy duck, gazing into this mirror. And what this plain old healthy duck sees relative to his health and his potential, he doesn't see reflected in this floor-length mirror a good old healthy duck. He sees a swan. And that, I think, is our dilemma. I think we may well be in such competition, say, with medical science, that we have not stopped to really savor and value who we are and what we know, and the responsibility of what we know to improve conditions for everybody's children, no matter where they're from and what they look like. And we fail to do that for some reason, and I really think that's an identity issue. That not to get involved in those messy, tricky issues, means then that we can see ourselves in a pristine way as that elegant swan, as opposed to that plain old healthy duck that has potential to make a difference. So I really think that as a field, I think we have an identity issue here. And I think from an Ericksonian perspective, what he was suggesting is that perhaps we need to start right here. We need to pull back in terms of, maybe males, or females, or whites, or blacks, or Asians, or whatever, and figure out who we are, our character as our plain old duck. As a plain old duck, and figure out who we are and what our challenges are, what our fears are, why we can't go there, and ask uncomfortable questions of ourselves and therefore of our science. And I think once we do that, and that's what Erickson is talking about, that you can embrace the other. You can embrace the uncomfortable if we know who we are. I think, and my hopefulness is that we'll be able to do that. That's my hope, because this generation coming up, I think, is much more comfortable than perhaps our generation. So I'm hopeful.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, I think we've run out of time, so please join me in thanking Margaret for sharing her experiences.